Ask almost anyone to name the most powerful steam locomotive ever built, and you will get the same answer: the Union Pacific Big Boy. It is the giant on the calendars, the star of the museum tours, the machine an entire country quietly decided to crown the king of American steam. There is just one problem with that answer: the records don't agree with it. Because hidden in the test files of a rival railroad is a locomotive that outmuscled the Big Boy on the single number that matters most, and then spent the next 80 years being forgotten. While the Big Boy became a legend, this machine became a footnote. While the Big Boy tours the country under its own power to roaring crowds, this one sits cold and motionless behind a velvet rope, slowly rusting in the dark. And the strangest part of all is that it never lost a fair fight. It was simply outmarketed. So here is the question this whole story is built around. Was the Big Boy ever really the most powerful steam locomotive ever made? Or did the wrong machine get the throne? Because being the best, as you are about to see, and being remembered as the best are two completely different competitions. And the most powerful steam locomotive ever built only ever won one of them. To understand the upset, you first have to understand just how total the Big Boy's grip on the public imagination really is. And honestly, it earned a lot of it. Built in the early 1940s by the American Locomotive Company for the Union Pacific, the Big Boy was a 4884 articulated monster stretching roughly 132 feet from the tip of its pilot to the back of its tender, and weighing well over 1 million pounds fully loaded. It was built to drag mile-long freight trains over the brutal grades of Sherman Hill and the Wasatch Range, the kind of mountains that stalled lesser engines cold, and it did it with a swagger no other locomotive could match. Its starting tractive effort, the raw force it could exert to break a heavy train loose from a standstill, was an enormous 135,000 pounds. By that measure, nothing in America pulled harder. And Union Pacific understood something most railroads of the era didn't. They understood that a machine like this was not just a tool, it was a story. So they told it relentlessly. The Big Boy appeared on posters, on calendars, in children's books, on the boxes of model trains that sat under Christmas trees across the country. It was photographed from heroic low angles, lit like a film star, given a nickname that a 5-year-old could love and never forget. 25 of them were built, and when the age of steam finally ended, the Big Boy didn't just retire, it was canonized. 8 of them survive today, more than almost any other class of giant steam, and one of them, number 4014, was hauled out of a museum, painstakingly rebuilt, and now runs again under its own steam, drawing crowds in the tens of thousands wherever it rolls. That is the champion. Undefeated, in the public mind, immortal, untouchable. So now let me show you the machine that, on paper, simply beat it. Because while Union Pacific was busy building a legend in the deserts of the West, a very different railroad in the coal country of the East was quietly building something more powerful, and almost nobody was watching. The railroad was the Chesapeake in Ohio, and its problem was coal. Endless, crushing tonnages of Appalachian coal that had to be dragged up and over the mountains that gave our story its name. By 1941, with the country sliding toward war and demand for that coal about to explode, the C&O went to the Lima Locomotive Works with a brief that was almost absurdly demanding. They wanted a single locomotive that could move staggering loads up steep grades hour after hour, without flinching. Not a sprinter, a marathon runner with the strength of a strongman. And Lima had exactly the right philosophy to build it. For years, Lima's engineering had been guided by a concept its chief design mind, William Woodard, had championed and turned into a doctrine. They called it superpower. The idea was deceptively simple, and it is the key to this entire story, so hold on to it. Most locomotive designers obsessed over tractive effort, the brute force of the initial pull. Woodard's superpower philosophy obsessed over something else entirely: sustained horsepower. The ability to keep producing enormous power at speed, mile after mile, by feeding the engine with a firebox and a boiler so large they could make steam faster than the cylinders could ever use it. Don't just yank the train into motion, the thinking went. Keep shoving it, hard, all the way up the mountain. The machine that resulted was the class H8, and the C and O named it after the very mountains it was built to conquer, the Allegheny. And it was a genuine giant, a 2666 articulated locomotive with 12 driving wheels. It weighed around 778,000 pounds on its own, and well over 1 million with its tender coupled behind, putting it right in the same monstrous weight class as the big boy itself. But the numbers that mattered were hidden in its proportions. Its boiler was 109 inches across, 2 full inches wider than the big boy's. Its boiler tubes ran 23 feet long, a foot longer than the big boy's. This was a machine built from the rivets up to make more steam than its rival. And then there is the strangest feature of all, the one detail that gives the Allegheny away to anyone who knows what they're looking at. Look at the wheels under the cab, at the very back of the engine. Where most locomotives ride on a 2 or 4 wheel trailing truck, the Allegheny rides on 6, a whole extra set of wheels tucked under the rear, and they are not there for traction. They exist for one reason only: to carry the weight of a firebox so enormous it needed its own dedicated support. That 6-wheel trailing truck is the visible signature of superpower. It is the Allegheny telling you, before it has moved an inch, that it was built to burn coal and make steam on a scale the big boy was never designed to match. But a wider boiler and a bigger firebox are just promises. The question is what they actually delivered when the engine was hooked to a dynamometer car and pushed to its limit. And this is where the legend starts to crack. So stay with me, because the next number is the one the entire video has been walking toward. Here is the figure everyone knows. The big boy is generally credited with producing around 6,290 horsepower at the drawbar. That is a colossal output, and for decades it has been quoted as the high water mark of American steam. Now here is the figure almost nobody knows. On the dynamometer, the Allegheny was recorded producing roughly 7,500 horsepower. Read that again. Not a hair more than the big boy. Not a marginal, arguable edge. Over 1,000 horsepower more, a margin north of 17%, and it was captured in ink on a moving paper roll by the cold and indifferent pen of a test instrument that did not care about reputations. To this day, no one has ever published a higher dynamometer horsepower reading for any steam locomotive that has ever existed. Not the big boy, not any of the European giants, not anything. The Allegheny isn't just more powerful than the big boy. By this measure, it is the most powerful steam locomotive the world has ever produced. So that settles it, right? The forgotten engine wins, the king is dethroned, case closed. Except, it isn't quite that simple, and if I left it there, every rail fan watching would be furious with me, and they'd be right to be. Because there is a twist, and it is the reason this argument has raged for 80 years. Remember tractive effort, the raw starting force? On that measure, the big boy still wins, and it isn't close. The big boy could exert around 135,000 pounds of starting pull. The Allegheny's calculated figure was about 110,000. The big boy was also longer, and its boiler ran at a higher pressure. So if your definition of most powerful is which one can rip the heaviest deadweight train off the rails from a standing start, then the big boy is your champion, and the Allegheny loses. So which number actually decides the crown? And the answer is the heart of the whole story. Tractive effort tells you how hard a locomotive can pull for one frozen instant, standing still. Horsepower tells you how much work it can actually do. At speed, over time, dragging a real train up a real mountain. It is the difference between a weightlifter's single heave and a marathon runner's endurance. And by the measure that reflects what a freight locomotive truly exists to do, sustained, relentless work in motion, the Allegheny doesn't just compete with the big boy. It beats it, decisively, and it beats everything else ever built on steel rails. The most powerful steam locomotive in history was not the one on the calendars. It was the one in the coal fields, and the dynamometer proved it. Which leaves us with the most uncomfortable question of all. If the Allegheny was demonstrably, provably, the more powerful machine, then why has almost no one outside of diehard rail fans ever heard its name? Why did the lesser engine become the legend? And the answer has nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with storytelling. Union Pacific marketed the big boy like a movie studio promoting a blockbuster. They gave it a name, a face, a personality, a place in the national imagination. The Chesapeake in Ohio, by contrast, treated the Allegheny like exactly what it was to them. A tool, a magnificent record-shattering tool, but a tool, sent to do filthy, anonymous work hauling coal through the mountains. Far from any camera or crowd, there were no Allegheny calendars, no Allegheny children's books, no heroic publicity tours. The C&O built the most powerful steam locomotive in history and then, in effect, forgot to tell anyone. And here is the bitter irony folded inside that. Because the Allegheny's genius was its sustained horsepower at speed, but the C&O mostly used it for slow, grinding drag service in the mountains, where what really mattered was tractive effort, the one category where it was weaker. So the most powerful engine ever built spent much of its career never even using its greatest strength. It was a record-breaking marathon runner that got hired to do deadlifts. It was overqualified, underappreciated, and ultimately unremembered. If you find the stories of these forgotten giants as fascinating as I do, the machines that were better than the legends and got buried by them anyway, then leave a comment and subscribe, because the history of the rails is full of them, and some are stranger than this. Now jump forward to today, and the injustice becomes almost physical. Of the 25 big boys, 8 survive, and one of them runs, touring the country, photographed by hundreds of thousands of people who line the tracks just to watch the king roll by. Of the 60 Alleghenies that Lima built, only 2 survive, and both of them are dead. Static, cold. One sits indoors at the Henry Ford Museum, the other at the B&O Railroad Museum, magnificent and silent, going nowhere ever again. The most powerful steam locomotive in the history of the world will never turn a wheel under its own power again, while the engine it beat on paper draws crowds across an entire continent. One machine won the test. The other won the legend. And in the end, the legend is the only prize history actually keeps. Because that is the real lesson buried under all that steel and coal. The Allegheny and the big boy weren't really competing over horsepower. They were competing over something far less measurable and far more permanent. They were competing over who would be remembered. The Allegheny had the better numbers, the bigger firebox, the record that still stands unbroken to this day. The big boy had the better story. And when the steam finally cooled on both of them, it turned out that the better story was the only thing that lasted. Being the most powerful machine in the world means nothing, it turns out, if you let someone else write the history. And yet, for all their differences, the Allegheny and the big boy share one final, fatal thing in common. They were both, at the moment of their greatest power, already obsolete. Because while these two giants were busy fighting over the crown of steam, a completely different kind of machine was being built in secret, one with no firebox, no boiler, and no coal at all. A machine that promised 8,500 horsepower from a single throttle and was designed for one purpose, to make both the Allegheny and the big boy look like relics overnight. They called it the locomotive of the atomic age. And the story of how it conquered Sherman Hill and then vanished from history so completely that almost no one remembers it ever existed is where we're going next.